Nathan had always found solace in routine. It was the one thing that tethered him to a world that often felt unpredictable. Every night, he drove the same route home after his shift at the toll booth. The empty road stretched out before him like a dark ribbon, cutting through the quiet town of Haydenfield. It was a job he didn't love, but one he appreciated for its simplicity. At night, the world slowed down, and for a few hours, he could exist without the weight of expectations pressing on his shoulders. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air was heavier, colder than usual. He shivered and turned up the heat in his car. Fog clung to the ground, swirling lazily in the beams of his headlights. As he drove past the old cornfield on the edge of town, he noticed something strange, a structure looming in the distance, where there had once been only empty land. He slowed the car, leaning forward to get a better look. A church. But that didn't make any sense. He'd lived in Haydenfield for years. He knew this road like the back of his hand, and he was certain there had never been a church there before. Nathan pulled over, his heart thudding in his chest. He wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions or let his imagination run wild. He was grounded, practical, a man who believed in what he could see and touch. But seeing that church, standing in a place it couldn't possibly be, made his skin crawl. He stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. The fog thickened around him, muffling the sound of his footsteps as he walked closer to the strange building. It looked old, much older than any structure in Haydenfield. The stone walls were weathered and covered in dark, twisting vines. A tall steeple rose into the night sky, its silhouette jagged and sharp against the pale glow of the moon. There were no lights inside, no signs of life, just silence. Nathan hesitated at the edge of the property. Something about the church felt wrong. It wasn't just its sudden appearance or the way it seemed to radiate an unnatural chill. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. He took a step back, shaking his head. Probably just some old building I never noticed before, he muttered to himself, though the explanation felt hollow. He turned back toward his car, ready to leave, when he noticed a figure standing a few yards away. An old man, hunched and wrapped in a tattered coat, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. Nathan hadn't seen him approach. In fact, he was certain the man hadn't been there a moment ago. "Strange night, isn't it?" the man said, his voice low and rasping. Nathan forced a smile. "Yeah, guess it is. Didn't know there was a church out here." The old man's eyes narrowed. "There wasn't, not until tonight." Nathan's smile faded. "What do you mean?" The man took a step closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "It wasn't here yesterday, and it won't be here tomorrow. That's how it works." Nathan opened his mouth to ask what he meant, but the old man turned and shuffled away before he could speak. He watched the figure disappear into the fog, a strange unease settling over him. Nathan didn't sleep well that night. His dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the echo of a bell tolling in the distance, though he was certain the church had no bell tower. When he woke, the uneasy feeling lingered, clinging to him like the fog that had wrapped around the church. He spent the morning trying to distract himself, making coffee, flipping through the news on his phone, pretending that last night hadn't happened. But the thought of the church gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his keys and drove back toward the cornfield. When he arrived, he was both relieved and disturbed to find that the church was still there. He had half expected it to vanish, as if it had been nothing more than a figment of his imagination. But now, in the daylight, it seemed even more out of place. Nathan parked his car and stepped out, squinting against the bright winter sun. The church looked exactly as it had last night, ancient, weathered, and eerily quiet. There were no signs of recent construction, no footprints in the dirt leading up to it, nothing to suggest how it had come to be. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. As he neared the entrance, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small plaque mounted beside the door. The inscription was in a language he didn't recognize, the letters sharp and angular, almost like runes. He reached out to touch it, but a sudden chill shot through his hand, making him pull back with a gasp. His fingers tingled, as if they'd been brushed by something cold and electric. Nathan frowned, rubbing his hand. He wasn't imagining this. Something about the church was alive. The door creaked open behind him. Nathan whirled around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the yawning darkness beyond the threshold. He took a step back, every instinct telling him to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before he could move, a voice called out from inside. "Hello?" It was faint, distant, like someone calling from deep within the church. "Is someone there?" Nathan hesitated. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It sounded like Emily, his daughter. But that didn't make any sense. Emily was at school, miles away. "Dad?" The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." Panic surged through Nathan. He knew it couldn't be Emily, but hearing her voice pleading for help made it impossible to think clearly. He took a step toward the door, then another, until he was standing at the entrance, staring into the shadows. The air inside was colder than outside, carrying a faint, metallic smell. Nathan's breath came in short, shallow bursts as he peered into the darkness. "Emily?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" There was no answer, just silence. Then, from the shadows, something moved. It was quick, too fast for him to see clearly, but enough to send a jolt of fear through his body. He stumbled back, his pulse racing. The door creaked again, slowly closing until it was just a crack. Nathan stared at it, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't go in there. Whatever was inside that church wasn't his daughter. It wasn't human. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of something on the ground, a set of footprints leading away from the church. They were fresh, too fresh to have been made by anyone other than the old man he'd seen last night. Nathan followed the prints, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. He didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Something had come to Haydenfield, something that didn't belong. And he wasn't sure if he could stop it before it was too late. But one thing was certain, he wasn't safe. Not anymore. Nathan had always been the kind of man who relied on what he could see, what he could touch, and what he could explain away. He trusted logic, reason, and routine to anchor him in a world that could feel as unpredictable and alien as the church that had appeared overnight. But then, as he stood before it, his mind was already starting to bend. Things weren't adding up. The events of the past 24 hours had cracked the solid foundation he'd always relied on. The church was still there the next day. The stone walls looked older, even ancient. The vines seemed to have crept further along its surface, as though something beneath the stone was growing, pushing, trying to get out. Nathan found himself staring at it again, at the silence that hovered like a thick fog around the church. He thought he could feel it pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. But he shook it off, turning away to try and focus on something else. There were still answers to be found. The next day, he decided to speak to the townspeople. Maybe they had noticed something he hadn't. Maybe they knew something. Surely someone else had seen the church appear. But then he remembered how no one had seemed surprised when he mentioned it, how the old man had seemed to know something without saying much. As he made his way into town, a strange numbness settled over him, like the world had suddenly become too bright, too sharp. The air was thick with tension, as though the land itself had been holding its breath. He first stopped at the diner where he often grabbed coffee before heading to work. There were only a few people inside. Old Mrs. Parker, who had lived in Haydenfield for as long as anyone could remember, sat hunched over her cup of tea, her eyes dull as she stirred it absently. She looked up when Nathan sat down, but didn't seem particularly surprised to see him. She didn't speak immediately, just watched him as though she already knew why he had come. "Can I get you anything, Nathan?" she asked in her usual monotone. Her voice wasn't exactly unfriendly, but it held no warmth either. He hesitated, then nodded. "I was wondering about the church, the one that appeared outside of town." Mrs. Parker's hands faltered for a moment, her spoon hovering above the cup as though the question had caught her off guard. But then she set the spoon down with a soft clink and picked up her tea again. "Church," she repeated slowly, her eyes narrowing. "There hasn't been a church out there in years." "But I swear it's there now," Nathan pressed. "I saw it with my own eyes. It wasn't there yesterday, but it's there now. How do you explain that?" Mrs. Parker didn't respond immediately. She simply continued staring at him. Her eyes now sharp, A flicker of something, fear or maybe caution, dancing in their depths. Nathan's skin prickled. The longer he sat there, the more it seemed that Mrs. Parker had seen something he hadn't, or maybe something she didn't want to see. Finally, she leaned in close, lowering her voice to a whisper, though there was no one else around to hear. "You don't understand," she said, her words measured. "That church, it's not just a building. It's a place that brings people in, but it doesn't let them leave." Nathan felt his stomach twist. "What are you talking about? What does that mean?" Mrs. Parker's expression grew hard, distant. "You'll find out. Just don't go there anymore. You can't trust it, Nathan. It changes things. It changes people." Nathan didn't respond. He had no words, no way to explain the feeling that crept over him, like the town itself was shifting, warping around him. Parker returned her attention to her tea as though she'd said all she needed to say. As if she had warned him enough. The day stretched on, dragging as Nathan tried to make sense of everything. But the more he thought about it, the more confusing it became. The church, the warning, the strange look in Mrs. Parker's eyes. Nothing made sense. And yet, everything felt wrong. He could feel the pressure of something vast and unseen pressing down on him, as if the town had become too small, its boundaries closing in. That night, he couldn't sleep. It wasn't the usual restless tossing and turning that came from the long hours of his night shift. No, this was different. He felt like the walls were closing in on him, like he was suffocating in a room that was still too wide. He lay there in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the house as it settled. And then there was a noise outside his window, soft at first, almost imperceptible. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound continued, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come closer. Then, a scraping, like nails against glass. Nathan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood and moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to peer outside. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, obscuring the town. But there, just beyond the line of trees at the edge of the yard, stood the church. Its silhouette was even darker now, more menacing in the shadows. And then he saw them, figures standing just inside the church, watching him. There were too many to count. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. His skin prickled with a strange mix of terror and confusion. His first instinct was to run, to leave the house and drive far away, but something held him in place. The silence was deafening, and the figures didn't shift, didn't move a muscle. It felt like the entire town was frozen, waiting for something to break the stillness. And then, as if on cue, a bell tolled from the church. A deep, echoing sound that seemed to reverberate inside Nathan's skull. It was too much, too loud, too oppressive. He turned away from the window, shaking. The air in his room was thick, stifling, and his thoughts were scrambling, fighting for clarity. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His head pounded, his pulse raced. Then he heard the knock at the door. A soft, steady knock, followed by a long pause. It wasn't the sound of someone urgent or panicked, just the steady rhythm of a person standing on the other side, waiting. Nathan froze, staring at the door. The knock came again. This time, it was louder. He walked cautiously toward the door, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who could it be? Was it the police? The sheriff? Someone from the church? But when he opened the door, no one was there. Only a single black feather, lying on the doorstep. The next day, Nathan couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. Everything felt off. The town was quieter than usual. The fog hung thick in the air, as though it were a permanent fixture now. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The church wasn't just a building. It was something more. Something that had always been there. Something that was pulling him in. That afternoon, he ran into Daniel, a man who had lived in Haydenfield for years. Daniel was always a bit of an oddball, eccentric, always with a far-off look in his eyes. But he had always been friendly. Nathan had often talked to him about his job at the toll booth, shared a beer on occasion. Daniel seemed even more out of place now. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. He was staring at the ground when Nathan approached him. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Daniel asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. "The church?" he asked carefully. Daniel nodded. "It's not supposed to be here. It's changing things. Changing us. You don't understand yet, but you will. It's already started. Nathan felt a shiver run down his spine. What do you mean? Daniel looked up, his gaze distant, unfocused. It doesn't stop. It pulls you in, and once you're in, there's no way out. His voice faltered. It's not just the church, it's the people, the town. You have to leave. You have to leave now, or it will take you too. Daniel turned and staggered away, leaving Nathan standing there in a cold sweat. He was right. Something had started, and Nathan was no longer sure he could escape it. But then Nathan noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. As Daniel walked away, he passed by the church, and for a brief moment, Nathan swore he saw something strange. Daniel's shadow, twisted and distorted, didn't quite match his movements. It lingered in place for just a moment too long before it followed him. Nathan's stomach dropped. The town had changed, and Nathan was already too deep to back out now. The air around Haydenfield had grown suffocating, the oppressive weight of dread pulling tighter with every passing hour. Nathan could feel it, deep in his chest, like a leaden weight pressing against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. The fog never lifted now. It had settled into every corner of the town, creeping into his thoughts, distorting reality in a way that made everything feel alien. The town was a place of shadows now, of half-forgotten faces and unspoken things. And that church, that God-forsaken building, had become a presence so pervasive that even his dreams were haunted by its bell tolling, its congregation whispering his name. For 2 days now, Nathan had tried to escape. He had packed his things, planning to leave in the dead of night, but each time he reached the outskirts of town, he found himself unable to move. The pull of the church was too strong. It was everywhere. The street signs, the houses, even the trees, all seemed to bend toward the church, as if the land itself was warped, tethered to something far darker. His mind was unraveling. Daniel's warning echoed in his head. It pulls you in, and once you're in, there's no way out. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination running wild, that he could escape this town, this curse. But now he knew better. It was too late. It had already begun. His life, the world he knew, was slipping through his fingers like sand. But now, something had changed. The church seemed to be calling him in a way it hadn't before, something deeper, more insistent. It was no longer just an eerie presence in the town. It was reaching out to him, pulling him like an unseen hand, urging him toward the inevitable. Nathan stood at the foot of the church steps, staring up at the Gothic spires that reached toward the darkening sky. The clouds overhead had thickened, a churning mass of black and gray that seemed to pulse with something unnatural. The bell had tolled again, its deep resonance vibrating through his bones. He could feel it vibrating inside his skull now, as though it was trying to sync with his heartbeat, to take over his thoughts. He had to go in. There was no turning back now. As his feet carried him forward, the church loomed larger, its twisted silhouette growing impossibly tall, towering over him in a way that seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. It was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, each step he took making the ground beneath him feel less solid, more unstable. His heartbeat quickened as he ascended the steps, his legs moving as though they had a mind of their own, unwilling to stop. The door stood before him, looming and unyielding, as though it had been waiting for him. And then the door creaked open on its own. A deep, hollow darkness stretched before him. The scent of damp stone and old wood filled his nostrils. The air was thick with mildew, and something far worse, something sour and rotting. Nathan hesitated for a moment, but the call was too strong. He stepped inside. The church was even more suffocating than he had imagined. It wasn't just the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. It was the sense that this place wasn't real, that the walls, the pews, the stained glass windows, all of it was a twisted parody of a church, a thing that shouldn't exist. The walls seemed to shimmer faintly, like they were made of some kind of fluid rather than stone. The floor beneath his feet creaked as he moved, but it didn't feel like wood. It felt like flesh, soft and pliable, as though the very foundation of the building was alive. And then he saw them. The congregation. They sat in the pews, hunched over, their heads bowed in prayer. Or perhaps they were waiting for him. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Nathan felt his breath catch in his throat. There were too many of them, too many for a church this size. Their stillness was unnerving, like they were frozen in time, but their silence spoke volumes. The air in the room was thick with the sense of expectation, a kind of terrible anticipation that made Nathan's skin crawl. At the front of the church, an altar stood, bathed in a sickly yellow light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. And there, behind the altar, stood a figure. It was tall, draped in robes so black they seemed to absorb all the light around them. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge Nathan's presence, but Nathan could feel it watching him. It was more than just a figure. It was a presence, a weight that hung in the air, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Nathan's feet moved of their own accord, dragging him forward. He didn't want to go closer, but his body betrayed him. His hands reached out toward the altar as though they were being pulled by invisible strings, moving faster and faster until he was standing at the foot of the altar. The figure raised its head, and Nathan froze. Its face was a blur, a mass of shadows and shifting features that twisted and contorted like something trying to take form, but never quite succeeding. It was as though the face was being molded from darkness itself. And then, through the shifting darkness, Nathan saw eyes that gleamed a bright, unnatural white. A light that didn't belong to the world, and they were staring at him. "You've come," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that reverberated through Nathan's bones. The words sounded like they were coming from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around him. "You've come to join us. You've come to become part of the whole." Nathan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, as though something was constricting around it. The figure continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Don't you see, Nathan? This is what you were always meant for. This is why you came to Haydenfield. You were always part of the plan. You were always meant to join us." The congregation stirred then, their heads lifting, their faces becoming clear. If only for a moment. They weren't human. Not in the way he understood it. Their features were twisted, deformed, their eyes too wide, their skin pale and smooth, as though they had never been touched by the sun. They were hollow, empty shells, their mouths twitching with inhuman smiles. A scream rose in Nathan's throat, but it died in his chest. "It's too late, Nathan," the figure said. "You belong here now. You always have." Suddenly, the walls began to shift, the stone cracking open like the earth itself was giving way. Nathan stumbled backward, but the room seemed to close in on him, the walls pushing in, the floor buckling beneath his feet. The congregation rose, their bodies jerking unnaturally, their faces distorting into grotesque masks of hunger and desire. Nathan turned and tried to run, but the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. The light from the altar flickered and died, plunging the church into total darkness. The sound of breathing, soft, uneven, unnatural, came from all directions. The floor beneath him felt as though it were alive, shifting and pulsing like a beating heart. Then, in the darkness, he heard a voice, a whisper, soft and familiar. "You never left," it said. Nathan froze, his heart stopping in his chest. It was his own voice, but it wasn't him speaking. The realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't Nathan anymore. Not truly. The church had already taken him. He had always belonged here, and now there was no escape. The town, the fog, the church, they were all part of it, all part of the plan to pull him in, to consume him, to remake him into something else, something that was no longer human. The last thing Nathan felt before everything went dark was the cold touch of countless hands, reaching for him, pulling him into the endless void that had become his home. And the bell tolled, louder than ever before. It had never stopped. It would never stop. If you made it to the end, I hope you're as creeped out as I am. But remember, the true horror isn't always what you see. Sometimes it's what you don't. So before you turn off the lights tonight, ask yourself, what's really lurking in the shadows? If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss out on more spine-tingling stories. And if you've got your own theories or experiences to share, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, never trust a place that feels too perfect.